Welcome to Voice for Infection Prevention, where we explore the latest developments, challenges, and insights in the field of infection prevention and control. With a passion for promoting patient safety and healthcare excellence, we're excited to bring you engaging discussions with experts, leaders, and innovators in the field. So whether you're a seasoned professional or just beginning your journey in infection prevention, welcome to the conversation. This is Voice for Infection Prevention.
Welcome back to Voice for Infection Prevention. I'm your host, Jacob Hutcherson. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Chris Zirges, a leader in the field of infection prevention. Christine's career journey is nothing short of impressive. With a wealth of experience and accomplishments under her belt. She currently is serving as the System Director of Infection Prevention at SSM Health. Christine has been instrumental in shaping infection prevention strategies and initiatives across multiple healthcare settings. In this episode, we'll dive deep into Christine's career trajectory from her early days as an infection prevention specialist at St. Louis University Hospital to her current role overseeing infection prevention programs at SSM Health. With over 2 decades of experience, Christine brings a unique perspective and invaluable insights to the table. Christine is a doctor of nursing practice and is certified in infection control. Join us as we explore her journey, discuss the challenges and triumphs she's encountered along the way, and uncover her strategies for driving excellence in infection prevention. Without further ado, let's delve into our conversation with Christine and gain wisdom from her extensive experience and leadership in the field.
This episode is sponsored by Clutch Recruitment, the leading recruiting firm in the country, recruiting exclusively within infection prevention and control.
Okay, so let's jump into this. Why don't you start by kind of telling, let me know kind of your role now, but then also back to the very beginning. How did you find out about infection prevention and end up in the field?
Sure. So I'm a system or corporate director of infection prevention, but I actually fell into infection prevention by accident. So by education, I am a nurse. I was a trauma nurse, but I did a lot of jobs. I had an unusual maybe pathway. So I was a trauma nurse, but then a position opened up in outpatient, like cardiac and pulmonary rehab. I did home health care. I was a director of organizational development. So opportunities came my way and I just took them. And it's really funny because things that maybe you're taking a job or an assignment is given to you and it may not be relevant or something that you don't think you really need or it's not of interest. Years later, I was able to capitalize on that experience. So I fell into infection prevention simply because I was working as a transplant nurse and heart transplant coordinator, actually. And that is a very high stress job, but I learned a lot in that role, how to manage multiple situations. But an infection prevention position came open. I was looking for a different job. Somebody was leaving their job and they needed help quickly. And it was a part-time position at the time, but it eventually became full-time. And 20 years later, here I am.
Wow. Okay. So let me ask you a question about that initial transition. And I'm kind of comparing this to the current kind of landscape, but what was attractive about, and obviously you hadn't done it yet, but what was attractive about the infection prevention role? Was there anything kind of practically, was it like better schedule, more money? Was there anything like that really caused you to take the next step, or was it just particularly fascinating to you?
It was really interesting when I first got into it. It's really a different skill set that you use, or maybe it's actually a culmination of a lot of skill sets. I should say that. And it's a little bit of detective work, a little bit of, a lot of interdisciplinary partnership with a lot of different folks, but it's really a lot of different pieces that you pull from, and it's very interesting. I mean, truly, when they say one day is not the same as the next, that is true. And early on, when I was a new infection preventionist, there was a state surveyor that came on site, and I did not freak out like most people do. So, and my boss was not available. So I had to sit in the room and talk to the surveyor, and I was new in the role. But one of the things the surveyor said to me is she knew to talk to infection prevention because they knew everything about the hospital. She said, they know everything. If you want to know what's going on, talk to infection prevention. But I learned really a lot from her as well, because they have a role to do. And I learned really a lot what they were looking for and somewhat of what their method to the madness was. So again, like just different skill sets, different opportunities that you meet people. But what even she said, we know infection prevention is a discipline that you really do know a lot about what's going on in the organization. And as another leader told me one time, we are really the only one of the few professions that have responsibility from the rooftop to the basement and everything in between. I mean, we've seen it all. I have had a hard hat on and been on a rooftop, and I've been in floods in the basement. So it's pulling on all those different skill sets and talents that you have.
Wow. So you said it started off as part-time, right? So
Yes.
were you doing the transplant nurse 20 hours and then another 20 hours for infection at that time? Or did you go you just wanted a part-time job, or what was that? I guess, what did that day-to-day look like?
Yeah. So the transplant job was really, it was a great job. So if, you're almost like a flight director. If you ever watch Apollo 13 and that flight director, that is what a transplant coordinator's like. That is literally what the job was. So it was very, very high stress. And I just had a lot of calls, no sleep. So I thought after 2.5 years, it was time to transition. And there was another part-time opportunity. And somebody talked to me about that and just said, hey, we have this opening. Why don't you come and try it? And, so I resigned from the transplant side and took that part-time job. But at that time, it didn't stay part-time for long.
Gotcha.
That a lot of changes were occurring in that organization. It became full-time, and I really immersed myself in that role. There's a lot of facets to infection prevention when you look at that role, and I really immersed myself into that role. So it just kind of bit me and took off.
Okay. So then were you the only IP at that facility?
There was a director who was an IP.
Okay.
But as it turned out, I think just things, I've always had these twists and turns in my career. As it turned out, she had a lot of health care issues, and a lot of the responsibility fell on me as well. So along with immersing myself in that role, I had to learn a lot of things rather quickly. But I think that transplant experience and being a trauma nurse helped. There's other backgrounds that help you to manage that, to how to quickly learn how to navigate situations you don't know. So I think I was, my background somewhat prepared me for really taking that on.
No, that's excellent. That's good. So listen, so you had a director, wasn't around a ton because of personal health reasons. How did you go about learning it? I mean, it doesn't sound like you had a particularly tremendous amount of support in the role when you first moved there, just because of kind of life. So what steps did you take? I mean, how did you go about learning the new practice? Obviously your background helped, but the things you weren't ready for, how did you go about that?
I think I was prepared well too. I might add, I had my master's degree by that point in time. And I think that preparation helped, regardless if you're put into a critical care director role, you're put into a director of radiology, you're put into a new field of infection prevention. There are always standards. There's always some scope of practice and standards. And that's really, immediately I joined APIC. And that is one piece of advice I just give to anyone going into a profession or early in your career is I've always joined the professional organization. So even when I was a critical care trauma nurse way back, I joined, that professional organization. I learned the scope of practice. I even sat for the certification exam. So the same applied. I took that same methodology being new to infection prevention. I thought, well, certainly there's a local APIC chapter. And there was. I joined it, brand new. And I actually got myself on a committee. I think I started small. I think it was the nominating committee. I would go to the chapter meetings. So along with learning what that scope of the role was, becoming a member of APIC, I would really became engaged in the local chapter meetings, and I got to really know who my peers were in the other hospitals in that region. And sometimes we would go out and do coffee, or I would go to the APIC meetings, and really it became more of a networking opportunity or advice. So I think that I would really give that advice to folks is just really join your professional organization and join the chapter, attend the meetings, and really create your network, because that was very beneficial for me early on. And then when I really did have questions, I knew you'd pick up the phone and just call and say, how did you deal with this situation? Or can you help me out? And that really, really did help me early on.
That's awesome. That's great. And you stayed in the specialist role for about 6 years. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then how big was that hospital?
That at that time, it was early on, it was an academic center, so
Okay.
A large tertiary care, transplant, trauma center. So, and I truly, it was probably maybe 350 beds, not terribly large, but also the scope of services. It was more very specialty. I think that while perhaps there weren't as many beds per se, every unit was specialized. So again, with learning the role of infection prevention, I had to learn transplant infection prevention, HEMOC unit. There was a geriatric unit, may have had a very specific needs for infection prevention. So I had to really learn the different specialties too, and what those infection prevention risks were in those specialty populations.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's that's a lot. So there's two things I want to ask here now. Then you mentioned that you got your master's degree at some point in this. So let's talk about that for a second. What was the motivation behind getting the master's degree at this point in your career? And then would you recommend that to other people?
Yes, and it's funny. You would laugh. People will laugh and question my motives. But at the time when I got my master's degree, I was working in a critical care unit, and I had some very good friends, and we often talked about, oh, should we go back and get our master's? We were literally at a Cardinal baseball game one night. It came down to, I'll do it if you do it. Well, I'll do it if you do it. So surrounding yourself with people that are also somewhat energized or engage you. So while it's funny, I think that's what it took, because we were all sitting on the fence, and being in that group of people, literally we were standing at the Cardinal game watching it, standing room only. And that's really what it took. And sure enough, several months later, we were in the classroom in our master's program. But there had to be some intrinsic motivation. It was something that we always wanted to do, just because of just advancing our careers. There was, I think the group I hung around with too, there was always that quest for best practice in our unit. What is that best practice? And, we had clinical nurse specialists that were really solid. I mean, you kind of become the, who you hang around with, if you will. So I was very fortunate to have individuals in my work life that were motivating or would just share pearls of wisdom with us, and sometimes motivating us that, hey, you might consider a master's degree, and you're kind of teetering about it. And sure enough, it just took that little extra push or peer pressure to do it. And I really, really loved graduate school. And I have to say at that time, while a thesis wasn't required, it was offered as an option, and I did the thesis route, which really also helped me with learning research, learning statistics, really seeking out evidence-based practice, which maybe at that time wasn't as popular or in mainstream as it is now, but those experiences I still draw on from today. So that graduate school was a very positive experience, but that's those several steps what took it helped me get over across the finish line and get into the classroom and do it and did it.
No, that's great. And then I want to ask in this role, so I'm looking at your LinkedIn resume here. So you had the specialist title. Director wasn't around a whole lot. How difficult was it, or what did you do to, I guess, demand the respect that's needed in that role? You talk with a lot of kind of greener IPs, and the question is, how do you, well, I've only got a staff title, so it's difficult to tell physicians what to do or tell these things. So how did you go about, one, just creating the culture that you wanted, but then also having the respect that you needed amongst your peers? Because ultimately you're managing everyone at the hospital. So how did you go about, just gaining the respect that you really need in that role without having the title?
That's really hard because, we say lead by influence, but it's really difficult. And I'm still cognizant of this phenomena that when you have two or more IPs at a hospital, by default, people always call the one that's been there for a while. It still happens today. So that was somewhat the phenomena that was occurring, even though the individual that I worked with, my boss, had some health issues. Sometimes, early on, they would only trust, the opinion of that individual. So I did have to overcome some hurdles. But I do believe, again, I go back to joining a professional organization. And I remember one of the first set of HICPAC guidelines that I read was hand hygiene. The hand hygiene guidelines, and I became very familiar with the authors on those papers, the evidence. So I learned early on, boy, I've got to pull some of the evidence too, so that I could speak with some authority and have the evidence behind me. So overcoming those hurdles and how do I stand on my own and get that respect is I did round a lot. I truly believe being out on the floors and rounding in the units. So I did that and really armed myself with the guidelines. I was aware of them. I would share them. And it also helped me when I would attend leadership meetings. And I, would have to go to the vice president of who my boss reported to, sometimes in her place. But it helped because I knew I had the backing, the expertise of an entire professional organization behind me, but I did my own research as well. So I was able to speak to that and outline it very clearly. And I do think it took a while, but I do think that did help. And you have to put the time into it to overcome some of those obstacles.
Yeah. And I'm sure the master's degree helped at that point, just with the thesis and the research piece of it.
It did.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. So let's look into the next position. After about 6 years or so, it looks like you transitioned to a role that has an infection prevention consultant title. What was that role? Was that just a standard staff role with the odd title, or was that something different?
No, that was a corporate role. So I noticed like the job prior that I just talked about, they became more of a large healthcare system. So that role I had evolved to me providing guidance or some evidence for system initiatives. So it was that job really turned into supporting a large corporation. There were many hospitals in that system. So that gave me some exposure on how to deal with standardization, working in a corporate setting role, how to leverage that expertise across multiple hospitals, because we were all called upon to do it. So the next job, the consultant job, was at another organization at a system level. And that was the title because our roles were to support the hospitals in that system. And so there would be initiatives, and you were their IP consultant. So I
Gotcha.
learned from the job prior all those skills that I'd learned, and standing on my own, and professional organization and evidence-based practice, all of that somewhat prepared me for that role. And
Yeah. And
that was a really fun role too.
yeah, I'm curious. Okay. What was the reporting structure like in the consultant role? So you're at the corporate level, you're trying to get everybody on the same page, I imagine, standardizing some processes and whatnot. Who did you report to?
Actually, I had two bosses at that time. So even though it was somewhat of a matrix organization, you did have functional leaders. So I did report up to more of a quality leader on one side, and the other side was more of an infection prevention, um, occupational health, occupational services leader, somewhat of a mixed title. So
Okay.
it was really a great experience because I had somewhat of the best of the both worlds. They had the
Yeah, no,
quality
that's great.
piece, and then that other piece is functional leaders. But again, it was also a matrix environment too. So you somewhat had your projects, your charge, if you will, and go forth. So I worked with a lot of leaders, but functionally, it was those two backgrounds or skill sets that I reported to.
Okay. So were you the top level IP at that system?
No, they still had a director of infection prevention at that time.
Okay.
So the structure was, or still was, director of infection prevention. There were also, you belong to a group, and there was also infectious disease, director, quality director. So there were various, I guess I would say, pods within the structure that had responsibilities. And so each of those pods, if you will, were reported up to a different functional leader.
Gotcha. So then, and I'm just trying to kind of make sense of it in my head. So is it kind of like your standard corporate role to where you've got these IP directors that are all kind of reporting up through their own hospital, but you kind of exist in more of a corporate role, kind of aiding all of these folks? Is that my understanding that right?
So there was more of, with that model, and there's various models even still today that we see. So that model was more of a center of excellence, if you will, where you had experts there, but it was still decentralized reporting.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
nobody really reported up through us, but we were more of the consultants with various expertise were in this group at the corporate level.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were one of two kind of main infection prevention professionals at that corporate.
There were several of us. I don't remember how many,
okay.
but there were several.
Oh wow! So you had a full-on corporate team then. Okay.
And everybody had everybody had specialty or different group projects that they worked on. And there were also pharmacists in that group, epidemiologists, Lean Sigma. So it was a very much an interdisciplinary group.
Yeah, that's a cool setup.
And it really was, because you could really draw on each other's expertise.
Yeah, I bet. How many hospitals did that put you kind of loosely over?
I believe at that time it would have been, maybe 12 or 13.
Okay, very cool. So you jumped into the corporate side of things pretty quick, which is awesome, and it makes sense too with how you're explaining it. What was the biggest change between kind of the day-to-day single facility rounding, jumping up to more of a just corporate role?
I remember they asked me on an interview that one of the questions was, how do you feel about not supporting one hospital per se and making decisions for one, but supporting a large grouping of hospitals and really developing, product or rendering advice across the board, and that was an easy transition for me. And because you have to have a mental model that it's not just about one hospital, but about 13 of them. But it was also, I really liked it because when you work at a corporate world, a kind of a setting there are different cultures in these hospitals. And I think that that's a very important thing to remember. And that's why I really, really am very interested in implementation, because I do believe in healthcare with initiatives. We don't have the implementation down as best we can. I do not think we're in an ideal state. There are different cultures. And that's really what I learned then, is that, boy, there are 13 different cultures here. A large academic medical center is very much different than a large pediatric medical center versus a small community hospital, and even the geographical location, patient population. And I really enjoyed traveling to all these different hospitals. I really enjoyed it because I really made it part of my role to learn their culture. What makes success here? How does it work? Who are the players? What does success look like? And I think that that made me a better professional, understanding that it's not one size fits all, and you have to appreciate that challenge. And sometimes implementation or the application, while it is a standard set of guidance, you have to sometimes think of the application thereof, and the application, you have to make it connect differently. And I go back to, remember I said early on, sometimes I have to draw on prior experience. I did do a gig in home health care for a while. And even today, I am now helping home health care put together an infection control plan. And I never thought that year I had in home health would make a difference. I am drawing on that because the set of standards we have for infection prevention, how do you apply that in home health? Well, I did home health, as they say in Lean Sigma, the Gemba. I did that job. I was in there. I know how they do their job and how infection control principles work. So that's what I had to learn in that role for 13 hospitals. Is it's the same standards, but we might have to apply it a little bit differently in this larger academic center as opposed to maybe a smaller, rural community hospital.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you definitely love the challenge. Did you like the day-to-day work compared to the kind of worker BIP?
I did. I loved it because I get my energy from people, and I really loved going on site and, doing rounds. And sometimes, I had the ability to round, with others on that corporate team. So, somebody, the safety person said, you know what, I'm going out to round at this hospital, next month. You want to join me? And so, we go on these road trips, and really when we get to the hospitals, they're really engaged with them and, do tours and help them problem solve or attend meetings. And that level of engagement really gave me energy, but also helped me become a better IP. How can I develop a better work product, or what factors do I need to consider when I'm writing protocols or standard or policies? How can I better make that application clear or the standards clear?
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to ask a question just because I want to get a clip that I think would be important. You've hit on it a couple times, but I want to hear the rant. Why / how important is it for an IP to be out on the floor as opposed to stuck behind a desk?
You cut out a little bit. How important?
How important is it for an IP to be out on the floor interacting with people versus being in an office behind a desk?
I think it's very, very important. And I believe in the profession of infection prevention, components of surveillance, mandatory reporting, the roles evolved more is more time spent perhaps on surveillance or reviewing cases perhaps than it is out on the floor. And my early experience, and again, I go back to I had to learn from that, I could walk through the units and pick up things quickly. I used to love environmental care rounds. I could go out on environmental care rounds and just pick up on things really quickly. I could walk a floor and really identify opportunities or risks or pick up on patterns or behavior and in coaching. So I think it's very, very important. And I do hope we can get to a place where we can get back to that level of rounding. I also think I was really blessed earlier in my career because when I entered infection prevention, there was a cohort that was starting to retire. And even in my local APIC chapter, I noticed this. Those individuals who were retiring, those were some of the original CDC trained IPs. And they used to call it shoe leather epidemiology. And they used to go out on the floors and round. And that's how I learned IP. And I really hope that we have better surveillance systems or, we're all looking at different models to help the IPs to get back into that forward facing role. Because that engagement, your observations, things you pick up on, sometimes could help you develop where kind of a mindset that, oh, this might be where our risks are. This might where I need to spend some time, some education or gaps. Or remember, I go back to that implementation. Maybe that implementation of this particular project or initiative didn't work because of what I'm seeing on the floor, or it may connect. No wonder I'm having surgical site infections. So a lot of those connections are made through what many people call go and sees.
Gotcha. That's a great answer. Okay. So, and I want to make sure I've got enough time to get through to your current role. So you jump from here up to a manager of infection prevention at St. Louis Network. So is that another corporate role or a manager over multiple hospitals, or was this more of a traditional manager, single facility?
That was more of what it was a network of 7 hospitals in a region. So it was a corporate role in a region. And that role really was, how we want to standardize these 7 hospitals. That's what we need to happen. And they weren't totally standardized at that time. So that role involved bringing those hospitals together and standardizing infection prevention practice, even surveillance, dashboards, policies, procedures. None of that was standardized at the time. So that was really the charge of the role. That is why the role was created.
Gotcha. And then not much longer. 3 years later, looks like you got promoted to a regional director. How much different was that job, or was that just a title change?
It was a little bit different because it became more strategic. And at that time, really, I put a business case together as well to have more staff. And there wasn't really a lot of support. It was myself and a part-time data analyst trying to pull all this together and standardize across the region. But I also put a business case together because not only is it the number of beds, but it's the number of outpatient procedures, and that was growing exponentially. And, the business was growing, and the complexity of infection prevention was starting to change. So really putting a business case together allowed me the ability to get more staff. So I was able to hire a full-time, epidemiologist, infection prevention epidemiologist. I was able to hire another IP at the network, what we call the regional level, to help with some of this work. So that's really when that change happened, because it became more strategic. And then we started dipping our toe into other regions in this healthcare system. So there were other regions as well. And so I actually started collaborating with those other regions too. So it became more strategic in one region, but also reaching out into the other regions where there's some opportunities that we could leverage the resources I had for across the system.
It's outstanding. And then it looks like, again, not too much longer, you're promoted to your current position now, which is over 20 plus hospitals. So it's a big deal. How, obviously there's more hospitals, so there's more cultures to identify, or more cultures to understand, and implementation becomes that much more challenging, I'm sure. But is there anything that you weren't expecting jumping up from kind of the 7 hospitals that you were started to be accustomed to up to, I don't know how many you have, 20, what, 23, 24?
23. Mm-hmm.
23 hospitals now. So was there any change you weren't anticipating making that jump?
Not so much. It's the complexity sometimes with standardizing policies and procedures. So they seem to come out of the woodwork. So I think you're trying to standardize practice, and you really can't minimize that, because as basic as a policy may seem, there might be some uniqueness in that hospital. And I think that that's one of the challenges we have, that it may take a while just to get one policy through. So I think that may have been one unanticipated challenge that to confound for, it's just an awareness, because there might be some uniqueness to that. And you have to have some conversations where, boy, we all have to come together as best we can. And what are we willing to negotiate and live with and live without? So it does take some maneuvering, but it is a challenge, because people are very passionate about their policies and procedures and protocols, rightly so. But I think that was probably much harder than I ever anticipated.
Gotcha. Now, do you have direct reports in this role, or is it all kind of?
Yeah, so we have a centralized report here, reporting structure. Gotcha. So the IPs all report up through regional managers who report up to myself. And I've noticed, like other parts of the country, this is the model that other healthcare systems are looking at. I have quite a few individuals that reach out to me to ask me about centralized reporting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely seen it go back and forth. We've had hospitals going out of that and coming back into it,
right?
And all sorts of stuff. So yeah, it's ever changing. Okay, so when it comes to your staff, how many people do you have ultimately that end up reporting to you?
Well, I have 8 direct reports, but
okay.
Overall,
and then they have their own teams.
They have their own teams, right? But collectively, we have a group of 34.
Gotcha. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to just a philosophy of infection prevention for you, now when it comes to hiring staff, where do you land? Do you prefer a very diverse background? Do you prefer as many nurses as you can? Do you prefer people that specialize in surveillance and people that like to do rounding? If you could have like an ideal situation, what would you go after?
Actually, I hired the first MPH when I started that regional role here.
Wow.
The first thing I did was the job titles were somewhat dated, and then out of the group of 7 hospitals, there were probably 2 or 3 different job titles. And at that time, an APIC position paper had just been released. So I was able to leverage that. And I go back to APIC and resources and standards. So I was able to leverage that competency model and job title with a vice president of HR, and made a change for the IP role. And at that time, they had RNs required, and they had a tiered system. So if you weren't an RN, then you had more of an IP1 role. If you were an RN, you had an IP2. So I leveraged all of that because it's the same competencies, right? It's at the end of the day, it's the same skill set, same competency. So I did hire the first master of public health, and the world didn't fall apart. It was great. And so now about a third of our team have a master's of public health. We have several that have a microbiology background. It is a very eclectic team. And I like different. And one of my mentors earlier in my career that I worked for, she was a mentor, but she was really unconventional. And she wanted to hire me for a job, the home health job. and said, before I hire you, why don't you come and meet the person you're going to report to? If you like each other, great. If you don't, no harm, no foul, and we were very different people and we got along great. So I think I learned I'm a little unconventional, and broader background, crazy experiences, the more the better. Because I think if you get a homogenous team, you're just never going to get out of this box. So I like an eclectic team because there's more than one way to skin a cat and solve a problem.
Yeah, that's great. And then at what point, kind of lost this in here, at what point did you go back and get your doctorate in nursing practice?
I actually finished my doctorate in 21. So a significant part of the coursework was during COVID. But I tell people there was nothing else to do. So we were in lockdown, but it really was, I went to a very, very, very good master's program in nursing. And I did that thesis. So I've always had a scholarly pursuit in me. So it was around in 2019 that I did begin my DNP journey. And I actually did my, thesis in CAUTI. So I chose a topic that was near and dear to my heart. So I was able to, on the DNP journey, utilize my infection prevention background and skill set. So it was really, and the DNP was really focused on leadership. So
excellent.
That I go back to, I had that intrinsic motivation early on, but the doctorate really did, it really was very beneficial to me because I think it embraced me even more with evidence-based practice and confidence to maybe question, that, hey, these are myths. This really isn't evidence-based, and maybe to challenge things a little bit more.
My last question, though, oh no, did I just forget it? Let's see. Oh no, my last question is it's what's next? What's next for you? And full context of this, I'm not trying to get you to say that you're looking or anything like that, but people at this level in infection prevention, there's not really a natural next step or a natural progression, and the things that you may think you typically report to quality, so just advance into quality. That's not an answer that most people give. You see people add, whether it's accreditation or occupational health or nursing excellence or just something else to their title. But when you really dig into that, they got paid an extra $5,000 to $10,000 a year and now have twice as much work on themselves. So that also isn't really a solution. So speaking more from an industry perspective, and then also a little bit from your end, what is next? And ultimately, I've heard a couple people mention this in these last couple interviews I've done, is maybe there's a goal for infection prevention to be its own service line down the road or something, because it just seems capped. Sure, there may be a few other health systems in the country that have more than 27 hospitals, but if you want to stay in infection prevention, that seemingly is your only option right now. So I'm curious, have you thought about that and kind of what's next?
Well, I'm really interested in the role and competency of the IP, and I'm currently on the professional development committee for National APIC. I'm vice chair, and I take over chairperson next year in 2024. And really affords me the opportunity to have some face time with the CEO of APIC and their vision. But really being on this committee, and I've been on this committee now probably 3 years, going on 4, is I have direct input with a great group of committee members, smartest people I've ever met, on what the role of the IP is going to look like in the future. And it is really, really exciting and unconventional. It's not just a clinical ladder, that we're looking at other pieces of it. So that's a whole committee, but being part of that and weighing in on that. So I think that journey is just taking skills and knowledge and leveraging that into other committees where you can be valuable and render that expertise. but also weighing in on it, because I do think infection prevention sometimes becomes limited, and they're the smartest people I know. I go back to, they know everything going on from the basement to the rooftops and everything in between. So I think that really is a great place I want to be in. The other thing is I joined a board of directors. Really, that helps. I've been on a couple of board of directors, and that helps because they do want the expertise of infection prevention, so you can leverage your knowledge. And I'm on a board in industry, and I am learning from CEOs and operation folks in industry, and they're learning from me. And it's causing me to think, and just working with an entirely different group of people. So board of directors is just another avenue for me to also, just be valuable, but also gain information back too, and help me practice my skills, but learn from a lot of other individuals that I don't see in those industry spaces day to day.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal answer. Okay. We've got 2 minutes. Do you have anything you want to make sure that young IPs hear, or any kind of closing comments you want to make?
I think it's join whatever field you go into, join the professional organization, be part of the meetings, volunteer, be on the boards, and then just take jobs, take assignments. If something's not interesting, you may not benefit now, but you never know. 5 years from now, you may benefit from it. You may draw on that expertise. So I would say, don't say no, and then really become engaged in your professional association and network.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Voice for Infection Prevention. We hope you found our discussions informative and insightful. Remember to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations with experts in the field, and don't forget to leave us a review to let us know what you think. For additional resources and to stay updated on the latest news in infection prevention, visit our website at voiceforip.com. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, stay safe and continue your commitment to excellence in infection prevention.